Yeah, gelatin is so nice for those
Yeah.
ultrasound IV catheter models. We've used Agar Gel, which you get in bulk online. It molds eventually, but you throw in a little bacitracin or whatever your antibiotic of choice is, that'll keep the bacterial colonies out, and then it actually is weeks before it turns to true mold. You can also break it down and reuse it when you're using agar. So what we'll do is 1 cup agar gel with 1 liter of water, and then add in a 1/4 cup of fiber supplement. And under ultrasound, it looks very realistic. The bubbles come out of it very easily. You do have to cool it for about 24 hours before it's ready to go, but it would work well with Claire's model for ultrasound guided IVs. And what's really nice about it is you can also use it for larger procedures. So we'll mount like latex tubing into a tray of some sort. I'm going to start using those trays from our central line kits that I keep throwing away. And the nice thing about it is you can do the procedure and then you can dilate and you can go through all the actual steps. You could insert the cordis, you could pass the pacer. You can't cut your Blue Phantom models or your fancy ultrasound guided IV models the way that you can cut through this gel. And you can do that all the steps that your students or residents need every time, and then just remelt it, break it down, and do it again. So as everybody here has alluded to, the real key with all these low fidelity models is that you make sure that all the steps that you're doing are accurate, right? The feel, the look, all the details of it don't have to be perfect, but every single step that you actually want them to replicate, that's where all the thought process has to be put in. And as everybody else has mentioned too, you tack that onto a low fidelity mannequin or person, a low fidelity person, we have lots of those where I work, and everything gets more interesting and more realistic. So if you're going to do a central line model, you put it on an inert neck, it's a lot more in terms of the mechanics of setting up the procedure and making sure all the steps and haptics are a little bit more interesting. Same with like, a cheap chest tube model, which you just mount on the side of an old mannequin chest and it becomes a little bit more interesting. Or you throw it next to a human being and they yell during the procedure and it just becomes a lot more cognitive load and a lot more experientially valuable for your learner. Please.
You mean just like running it on top?
No, just a tiny bit mixed in. Yeah, and it seems to have worked pretty well. Like less than a gram. So we're going to talk about a couple things very quickly. These models all came from our fellows. So this current one that we're going to talk about, the Ranger model, is from our current fellow, Scott Reichelderfer, who's going to be taking over SIM for EM program over at UC Fresno. He did a wonderful job this year trying to figure out models that our residents needed. And that was really the key, is just finding those gaps in education, identifying them and deciding on something to do to kind of bridge that gap. Writing down all the steps as you go and ideally having some plan for validation, which we'll talk about later, can turn it into a publishable project. Finding residents who've had an experience with the procedure that they want to do more of or didn't feel prepared for is very, very helpful. And these can, at least at our institution, fulfill the need for an education or even research or quality improvement project, depending on what you're doing. And when you do that, you not only have an interested learner / teacher, but you have free labor and you have a potential for a project that's going to be publishable. So that is like the greatest resource in the world, is just finding people who are interested in filling some gap and then going through the steps of identifying that gap, building an appropriate model, and validating it in some way. So the Silicon Ranger model, which we built, was a lot of fun. All beef frankfurters were used as the medium, and dowels, just wooden dowels, were used as bone. Right, so we noticed that, at our institution in the ivory tower, ortho comes down and cuts the bone off for you, but you go to a community site, they're going to tell you over the phone to just do this yourself, right? So almost all of my residents felt unprepared for this procedure. So what we ended up doing was using a good quality hot dog, so it has a little bit of no casing on top of it, and getting a wooden rod and then baking it to the point where it was actually, when you cut it with the Rangers that we borrowed from our orthopedists, it actually felt like that bony splintering that you can kind of get when you actually do this procedure on a real person. So we found that the 1/4 inch baked at 350 degrees actually dried them out enough so when you cut it, it splintered and came apart just the way real human bone felt like it did. And then in addition, we added a skin matrix on top, and in this case we just used sheets of silicone We had played with silicone and ballistics gel before. Silicone is nice. It like backscatters on ultrasound a lot, but it does pretty well for holding together for suturing. So we've used it as a skin supplement rather than latex in some circumstances. So we inserted the rod into the midst of this hot dog matrix. We've used jerky for this as well. And then we ended up wrapping it in the silicone skin, cutting it down a little ways so that you actually have to remove some of the tissue, cut back the bone with the rongeurs, and then suture up the skin appropriately for the procedure. This felt very real, and we had our quasi-validation, which is a resident who had to do this at another site. 1 week later, it seems like that almost always happens with new procedural trainers, said, yeah, that felt just the same, and I'm very impressed. Unfortunately, you can't publish that, but you can talk about it. And then, the next step in our validation model was to go to all of our hand surgeons and have them do this, and our orthopedic residents and have them do this, and just give a sense, a rating on a Likert scale of how much it felt real to them compared to the real thing. And that's not, the world's greatest validation, but you have an expert do the procedure on your model and say that it feels realistic. That's pretty good evidence that you're doing a decent enough job. At least in our world, that probably constitutes some of the best you might get. So simple, easy, smelled kind of good. Everybody seemed to enjoy it. And just a wonderful product from our resident that he's going to take and use at his new institution, and I hope you all try to. Now, our other fellow, Dr. Jeff Usui, who is going down to LA to work in a community site where he's going to be doing some sim work, wanted to do the auricular hematoma drainage, right? So this is another procedure that we are all supposed to be able to do, but I never have, and I wouldn't really want to, and I know that my ENT doctors would end up doing it for me, but you work in the right location, you may have to do this yourself. So he went all out to try to build a model so our residents could be trained. So he molded an ear out of silicone again. And we'll go through the steps right here. It was, not the cheapest model in the world, but it was still very affordable. So he actually bought some silicone that we paid for via the Sim Center. We've used this for multiple things at this point in time, but it took a little bit of money just for that. So there you go. There's your initial investment, but you can use this for a lot of different models over time. So he built his own box, which I was pretty impressed with right there, and then managed to take these ear models that he bought offline to make his own mold. We were going to use his ear, but it was too hot. Once we did that, we had our own silicated ears that we were able to do out of this mold that we had built ourselves. Took about 24 hours for them to clear. And then, we don't have an underlying hematoma, although if you really worked on this, you could probably do that by adding a second layer on top. But really the point was to go through all the steps of actually suturing this thing in place. So we talked to one of our ENTs, they walked us through how to do the procedure, we got the right materials from the emergency department, and our residents all practice. And each model could take this process a couple different times in order to get a hematoma drained and stabilized. So they'd make their incision, they'd suture things into place, they would make sure that the firmness of it was appropriate. After discussing with the ENT, we were able to kind of get a sense for how exactly it should feel afterward. And what was very nice about it is you could kind of place those sutures in the right locations, check to make sure they were appropriate, get everything nice and firmed up, and then see how it was working. We haven't had one of our residents come back and tell us how it's worked because they haven't done this in person yet, but it was enough to actually have something to work on.
Great.
That would be appropriate for this procedure. I think we'll make it very soon. Very quickly, we have another model for our lateral canthotomy. This is not quite the famous Narain Nadir Trump mask model that caused all that controversy 3 years ago, but we've done something similar with the Guy Fawkes mask recently. And again, same kind of idea, but different device design, using a lot of products that we bought over at the store, tiny little rubber bands, little hooks, and we're able to mount it into this mask and go through the procedure using foam tape, just like Dr. Desmond was saying just a moment ago. So if anybody wants to see this model, you are welcome to take a look, and I can share it with you, but the one you have here is going to be just as good, albeit this one is a little bit funnier looking. And lastly, for those of you who are talking about other models that you want to build, we've presented a couple different things over the years that we didn't bring with us today for presentations, including some chest tube models, some pacer models. I had a thoracotomy model, which I built in like 2013, which is still working. Our small group over there is going to just be talking about going through the process of creating a model and validating it. So we can talk about that in just a few minutes if you're interested. And I can share with you those presentations too if there's stuff that you want to grab from us. So let me dial this back here. And we're going to take a break for 10 minutes, and then we have 4 stations set up.